It cuts to the heart of confidence about ourselves and our generation, whether we can manage this. There are a couple of key issues that I think are very different in the next 40 compared to the last 40. Apparently we're now no longer allowed to build dams, and I think that is a big issue, and I think we need to think laterally about how we can manage that. And power. Show me the state government's going to build a coal-fired power station in the next 40 years. We need to have a nuclear debate in this nation going forward. There's some very unpleasant facts or truths that need to be addressed by this nation. One is tax, one is water, one is power going forward. And I think all of those flow from Big Australia.
Thank you. So we've got clearly two different looks here. I think Bernard's arguing that we don't actually have a choice and what we have to do is manage the outcome. This comes to one of the questions that was set for us about how scalable and capable is our current social fabric and our infrastructure, both social and physical. Mm-hmm. Can you address that question?
Okay, and you'll find I disagree utterly with Bernard on this, as indeed does the economics editor of The Age, Tim Colbatch, as indeed is the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Ross Gittins, both of whom have described the ageing population scare as essentially a scam, as has Jack Waterford, the former editor of the Canberra Times. The British House of Lords also looked into it because the same ideas were put up in Britain. They found, again, there was nothing in it. There is a normal demographic transition going on. The imaginary lack of labour is the reverse of the truth. The fact is we have a terrible oversupply of labour. But just before I get on to the ageing population thing, which could well take up the rest of the talk,
there is I won't let it.
Good. There is another huge issue that has been well put in an article in Online Opinion by the University of Queensland's Jane O'Sullivan. She points out that the cost of the ageing population is really very, very small, even on the Treasurer's figures. But the cost of infrastructure for population growth is enormous. And one of the points she makes is, in every city where you're getting a real backlash against population growth, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, it's people seeing that the infrastructure doesn't keep up. When was the last time we first built the railway and then we added the suburb? We do the reverse. We push the people in. As the economist Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute says, it's like, come on in, there's a barbecue on, bring a plate, bring your own food, bring your own table, bring your own chair.
But
nothing
couldn't
provided.
That change?
This is what I'm coming to. Yeah, people. So when this point is made to premiers like Anna Bligh, who started to admit there is a real problem with population growth, as she says, people are really hurting, she says, well, we just haven't provided enough infrastructure. We politicians are going to have to roll up our sleeves and do better, as if no one had ever thought of improving infrastructure before. But no one had quite seen why you can't. Very simple explanation from Jane O'Sullivan runs along this way. The usual economist rule of thumb is that infrastructure, all those things we need to lead a civilised life, lasts about 50 years. So in a stable population, you have to replace about 2% of infrastructure each year. Obviously, some things like buses wear out faster, sewers more slowly, but 2% a year is a sort of rule of thumb. And that takes about about an eighth of GDP, of annual GDP, has got to go into infrastructure, often via the tax system and via the public purse, but some of it via the private side, just to keep up, just to stay where you are. Now, what happens if your population is also growing at 2% a year? Does this increase your infrastructure cost by 2%, 20%, or 100%? And of course, once you think of it, the answer is obvious. It increases it by about 100%. And that's why all these places are up against real problems. Additional problems are, of course, that the huge excavation machines and so on of today are working with oil that's costing 40 times as much as it used to. Energy costs have gone up enormously. There are many reasons why we're not getting ahead. So by the time you've got 2% population growth plus 2% infrastructure wearing out, you're going to need something like a quarter of all GDP put into just replacing infrastructure, not to get ahead, just to stop things getting worse. That's one reason why in practice we see this impasse that all state governments are caught in. Coming back to the ageing population thing, this has been a favourite of the business lobby and the business council, property council for decades. The demographer Christabel Young at ANU used to give a very short shrift. She used to point out we have never had such a high percentage of our population in their working years. And it still didn't stop them going on about how we would all age. Nowadays, it is true that we're moving towards an even-sided population structure. This is not a disaster. But basically, Australian women are averaging 1.98 children each. That's the latest figure from the Bureau of Statistics. So instead of having these very uneven population pyramids with far more people in their younger years, and thus great population growth predicted, we're getting a relatively even-sided cylinder in which there are roughly equal numbers in each 5 or 10 year group up to that age at which, death starts to narrow off, and then you start to get a bit of a pointy top to the thing. And this is what you want. So one generation replacing another without massive population growth, which is why we have a choice, because basically natural increase, which has been very high, is still rather high at about 170,000 a year, more births than deaths, is eventually going to come down towards zero and may only add another 1 or 2 million. So when we look at these vast future populations, 50 million, 100 million, even the minimal 36 million that the government admits to, we're talking almost entirely of immigrants being deliberately added to push up the population. Okay, so the myth that there is no labour, it's certainly not true at present. About 100,000 young Australians dropped out of the workforce last year, essentially because they don't have the sort of resumes that trained, skilled immigrants brought in have. Employers prefer people who are pre-trained, who have a resume, who are ununionised and docile because they're glad to come into the country, though they don't stay so once they know their rights. So it's a very temporary advantage being sought by employers at a very huge cost to the rest of us. There are many, many other elements to this scam, but above all is the belief that the old cost more than the young. They don't. The young are enormously expensive. Most young people can't work till they're 20, and the most productive and able-minded probably should stay in their studies till they're 25 or more. So these figures that look at the working age population as 15 to 64, that's rubbish. It's more like 20, and in the future it will be to 69, I'm sure. So as we have more elderly people who are too old to work, at the same time we have fewer young people too young to work, we will never again have as bad a dependency ratio as we did in 1947 when I and my sisters were crawling around the floor in the huge families of the baby boom, totally unproductive, and yet we got by.
You're probably producing something.
Hey?
Oh, I was just, I was just, sorry, that takes a while to go. I was really kind of, I'm just reflecting there. I love that sort of demographers speak, that it's only women who have children. I just thought that was fascinating. Anyway, I want to kind of move back to Bernard and ask, what is it that makes you more optimistic that we can manage this growth and that our infrastructure and our social fabric as well, which we haven't spoken about, are up to it? And then I'm going to kind of open it up to the audience, so get ready.
Well, in fact, Mark is right. I'm not a demographer at all, and I'm sure real demographers. Are amused by that tag in the media. I'm actually an historian. I have a master's degree in urban history, specialising in Australian urban history. So I have a very good sense of where we've come from and where we're going to. My confidence is that if we have been able to do this in the past, then we should be able to do it in the future. It does not mean that the way we live today is the way we will be living in 2050, just as the way we live today is very different to the way we lived in 1950. So my view is that this is about managing the issues. If we aren't allowed to build dams, for example, then perhaps we should mandate that every household have a 4,000 litre water tank. That's a policy response. If we're not allowed to build a coal-fired power station or a nuclear power station, and if wind and solar isn't developed, then maybe every household should be mandated to have a solar panel to make it on their roof, to make a contribution to the power grid. So there are ways in which you can actually respond or adjust to manage the way forward. I'm simply unconvinced by assertion after assertion that there is no issue with the labour. I'm sorry. 4.5 million people exiting the workforce, jumping into a space now occupied by 2.5 million. I hear the assertion, I hear it time and time again. Show me in real numbers. I live in a very, very practical world, and in my opening address I said exactly what I wanted. And that was that the 457,000 people Australia has at the moment is hypergrowth. It's too much. It needs to wind down to about 350, which is above the long-term average of 220. What I would like to know is what is Mark's view of the policy going forward. We now have a situation, regardless of whether we should or should not be in this situation, you've got the hands on the wheel. What do you want to see? I'll put this to you, Mark. What do you want to see the policy over the next 10 years? What should we do? Stop immigration? Should we stop reproducing? We're producing 150,000 people per year through natural increase. If we were to stop population growth, would we be exporting those? Would you be telling refugees that they should not be coming to Australia? Would you be telling teachers and doctors and nurses and other skilled people who are brought into the country that we don't want you as well? I have a number of these debates around the country, and I get all of the arguments, and I understand they're very sensitive to them. I appreciate that. But I've never heard one of the objectors to growth to say, well, look, here is a plan for going forward. Reduce it from 457, and here is the way it would actually unfold over the next 10 years. It's all airy-fairy. It's all on principle stuff. Well, I'm a practical person. Tell me, what would you do over the next 5 years, 10 years, in order to bring the population into line, and how would you manage the consequences?
Okay, I am actually going to move to the audience for a question, but this is one of the last group, just because to get some other voices in as well. But the question you've asked is one of the questions that we are kind of due to get on to asking, which is, you know, how much control do we have as a sovereign nation over some of these? I am now relieved that even though I've added to the population by being a migrant, I haven't had any children. So I'm kind of, and I didn't come because I was docile. Anyway, just a quick last question. I will put this question to Mark, but I want to get some other voices in as well. Who'd like to? There we go, down there, and here and here. Okay, great.
Hugh Morgan, ADC. At the expense of being dismissed pejoratively as a big business donor and ex-president of the BCA, could I just add an extra dimension to both presenters for consideration? We have a habit, I think, in this country as looking at the issue of immigration and population numbers as if it is solely our choice. It is not our choice. The rest of the world looks on us as occupying 6% of the world's landmass with a tiny population. We have a large, high standard of living, and much of the rest of the world thinks that we are mean. They say so. I have quotes from churches, all sorts of NGOs talking about our mean occupation of this country. Our percentage of the population today as a percentage of the total world isn't much different from the time when Captain Cook arrived and you looked at the Aboriginal population and the rest of the world population since then. We have to take into account that we need the respect of the rest of the world as to how we manage, occupy, and have an immigration policy here as part of the debate that we've just been talking about. So much of it is looked upon as if it's solely our choice. The time will come when we need the respect of the international community if and when we are challenged by immigrants from other countries on a mass basis. And we will not have that respect unless we are seen to have an aggressive immigration policy here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take this as a contribution. Is it gentleman here in the second row on the right? I'll just take 2 or 3 contributions and then go back to our panellists. And then could we pass the microphone back in to get ready for the gentleman in the white shirt at the back? Thanks.
Okay, Tony Brun, City of Geraldton in WA. One of the concerns, and I raised it at the last session we had, which was related to urbanisation. It almost appears like the old Brisbane line that was debated in World War II actually became official government policy. The talk about this population debate is out of the prism of Sydney and Melbourne and a bit of Brisbane. There's very little about what the opportunities are. In a city like ours, we're at a focal point of some fairly significant resource developments. We actually produce more energy from wind energy than we actually consume. So our current city is 35 megawatts of power. We have 50 megawatts of wind energy in our area. So in effect, we're one of the first carbon neutral areas in Australia. We've got proposals for new renewable energies for 650 megawatts of power already. That's extra power coming on that's clean. We've got 250 gigalitres of water that's unused, and we don't need dams. One of the natures of geology in WA is that we didn't end up with rivers on the west coast.